in general, practitioners, nonprofit professionals, we're talking about either what we call Model A, Model B, or Model C fiscal sponsorship. That terminology is not legal language. You won't find this in any IRS rulings or state nonprofit corporation statutes. This comes from practitioners. There was an attorney named Greg Colvin years ago wrote this up in a book, Fiscal Sponsorship: 6 Ways to Do It Right. And there may be even more ways to do it now. And those were names that at least were in that book. I don't know if he created them. But I'll describe the differences this way. Model A and Model B are kind of similar. Model C is fundamentally of a different character. But under a Model A and Model B fiscal sponsorship, the fiscal sponsor is operating the program, the fiscally sponsored project, under its umbrella as one of its own programs. In other words, the fiscally sponsored project is not a separate entity. This is just all being done under the umbrella of the fiscal sponsor. So when there's a bank account for the project, it will be the fiscal sponsor's bank account. The fiscal sponsor will usually own the name, trademarks, all the things associated with the program. So it really is part of the fiscal sponsor. And where Model A versus Model B comes in is with regard to the project leaders and the people who operate and run the project. Under Model A, those are employees of the fiscal sponsor. So on the payroll, W-2, all of that. Under Model B, they are independent contractors of the fiscal sponsor. So that's the distinction between Model A and Model B. And you can certainly have some employees, some independent contractors, so it kind of blends. But that's the fundamental character of Models A and B. Model C is very different. That's sometimes referred to as a pre-approved grant relationship. And in that role, the fiscal sponsor is much more hands-off. Their role is to receive grants and donations for the project, and they're not so directly involved. They're not directly operating the project under their umbrella. They are just granting out the money from the project fund, subject, again, as I said, subject to their discretion, control, oversight. But in the Model C arrangement, the sponsored project is typically an entity, an LLC, a nonprofit that does not have a 501c3 status yet. So really the fiscal sponsor's role is much more limited. They receive the money, they supervise, they grant it out, and then the project has a lot more freedom as to managing the day-to-day details of the project. Although they, as we'll talk about, they typically need to report back and say, okay, we received the grant, this is what we've been doing.
So Ben,
So that's a quick overview. Yeah.
You mentioned something that it might be an organization that is not a C3 or is in startup mode. I think the other place that I've seen it where organizations might have been around for a while and still have a fiscal sponsorship might make sense because they don't have the capacity to run a type of program. They might not have the expertise or the number of staff. I just want to throw that out there. It's not always where I've seen, where the sponsoring organization is actually smaller than the organization, but they have the staff in place, they have the researchers or they can pull it off.
Right. Yeah. And that is where terminology can get very complicated. Because are we talking about fiscal sponsorship in that instance? Or are we talking about two organizations getting together to jointly run a program?
Exactly. Yeah.
And one organization has one role, the other organization has another role. Or are we talking about some kind of arrangement for back office support and nothing more? So it's
interesting.
Yeah. At a certain point, it's like, well, does it matter what we call it? What matters is what's more important are the fundamentals of the relationship. But for my purposes, I think of it as fulfilling that 501c3 recipient role where you're going after grant funds that need a 501c3 and the project does not have that status, or you want people to be able to make tax deductible donations and you need a 501c3 for that. So in that narrow sense, that's usually what I'm talking about.